time for some more kitchen table astronomy at the Amherst table of Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe. Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak. Thank you very much.
And that's what we're going to talk about today, astronomy and Eid.
Absolutely. But before we do that, I do want to promote a science on screen film at Amherst Cinema tomorrow on Tuesday. It's The Martian, which a lot of people love. And it's
With
going
Matt Damon.
With Matt Damon, and it's going to be introduced by Mount Holyoke professor Dr. Darby Dyer. And she's fantastic. She has driven a rover on Mars,
She's got like the joystick at the Jet Propulsion Lab, right?
Right, and now
she's driving it. It's more complicated than that, but that's how I imagine it. It's like Atari, and there's Darby Dyer, the professor, driving the rover on Mars.
It's just like that. No, but she now is actually in charge of sort of like one of the Venus missions that is going to go NASA mission. But here she'll be talking about the Martian, so that will be fantastic. And I also want to apologize for my Leonard Cohen voice, and that's not because I have a cold or COVID or anything. It's because of evolutionary mistake in terms of allergies, where the body reacts to things that it should not be. It should be pretty straightforward. It's beautiful, it's spring, it's green, and I find it very oppressive.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, you do have a happier type celebration with Eid. For those who aren't familiar with the Muslim celebration of Eid, which I gave you the greeting, Eid Mubarak, at the beginning, tell us what that commemorates.
So that is the end of Ramadan. And so Ramadan is the fasting month, and for people who do fast, that's the fasting month. You still commemorate end of Ramadan, so people like me, for example. And so this is sort of like, an equivalent of Christmas in that sense. And growing up in Pakistan, it was really amazing because you have pretty much sweets. You eat sweets most of the day, and you visit people, and people come to your house, and so on and so forth. But what I want to talk about here is the astronomy part, because Islamic months are based upon the moon. And there are interesting controversies about that, including pretty much every year there are disagreements about when Eid is going to be. And so that's sort of like, which has to do with astronomy.
Because Eid begins when you first see the moon? Is that signify the beginning of the next month?
Right. So every month, so Islamic calendar is moon-based. And
also one of the most famous Islamic symbols is the crescent moon.
The crescent moon, right. So the way it starts is that when you see the moon, okay, and here I'm using the quote, see, because that's where the debate comes in, right? So when you see the new moon as a crescent, then the following day would be Eid, for example. And it's for every month. But of course, for 11 out of 12 months, people don't care. It's like, oh yeah, okay, all right.
But when you can't eat or drink anything during daylight hours for an entire month, you are looking for that moon.
That's exactly right. And that's what leads to a lot of controversies. It's also the beginning of Ramadan and the end of Ramadan. So everybody's attention is there, and especially at the end of Ramadan. Are you going to be celebrating it or not? Now, here is the problem. And I remember this back in my undergraduate days when I was at Stony Brook, and I was an astronomy major. And I remember telling my astronomy professor, I was like, oh, by the way, I don't know if I'll be in class tomorrow or the day after tomorrow because of Eid. And he was a nice guy, and he was curious. He's like, he's like, that's okay. But may I know why? And I was like, well, it's unclear when the moon sighting, when the crescent is going to be there. And I remember him saying, sort of like, very polite way, as you can imagine. He goes like, it's not any of my business, but you are an astronomer. I mean, we do know where the moon is. And I was like, yeah, but it's complicated, right? So that's what I want to talk about. So there are two things. One, the actual science issue. We can calculate where the moon is with respect to the Earth and the Sun for millions of years. For the next 100,000 years, I can exactly tell you. And there is the definition of astronomical new moon. Astronomical new moon is basically, roughly, it's when the moon is very close to the Sun, and so nobody on Earth would see the moon at all, right? So So this year it was, for example, on Friday, couple of days ago. Now, that's the new moon astronomically, where you don't see anything. But remember, the Muslim symbol is a crescent. Now, that's a little bit beyond the astronomical new moon. And so, usually, crescent is very thin, few hours after the astronomical new moon, and we estimate that it has to be about at least 14 hours, at least, past when you can't see the moon at all. Then it is.
Is we astronomers or we Muslims?
We,
everybody. Humans.
And so, meaning to say, you won't be able to see, the crescent will be so thin, you won't be able to see it.
Okay.
But you will be able to see it once it's roughly. And again, there are a lot of other factors coming. Pollution can come into, and the point is that it's after sunset as well. Because remember, the moon is close to the sun. So how high it is at the sunset time and how thick it is. So there are multiple things that go. That's not important. The point is that in some places, so for example, this year we knew that in Pakistan, there is no way the moon would be too young to be seen in the evening time on Friday. So on Thursday. So we knew that Eid in Pakistan should be on Saturday, and thankfully that's what happened, right? But because the U.S. is about 9 hours behind Pakistan, so the moon, by the time moon sets here, the age of the moon is 9 hours more, and so it can be thicker. So this is very technical mumbo jumbo we are talking about. But the point is that you can have Eid in different locations purely based upon how much thick the crescent is.
So Eid in Pakistan was Saturday, but Eid here in the U.S. was Sunday?
That's exactly right. On Friday.
Oh, so Eid was Friday in Pakistan and Saturday here?
No, let's try one more time. It was Friday in the U.S. and Saturday in Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
And the reason is because it was seen here, the moon could be seen here on Thursday night because it's a little bit older. You see, so there is this inbuilt complicated system in terms of whether the moon would be visible or not. So that's purely that thing. And so different areas, for example, celebrate at different times simply because of that. And remember, in the US as well, there is a 3-hour difference between the East Coast and the West Coast.
Yeah.
So by the time the sunset comes around on the West Coast, the moon is 3 hours older. So and so anybody who sees in the US, for example, now whatever I've said, it's confusing and all that stuff. Don't worry about it. Here is the big sort of like issue. Should you use calculations, or should you use your eye or somebody should see the moon and report it and use that? And that has been a big controversy because some people think that no, calculation should not be used because the Prophet in Islam, or around that time in the 7th century, people did not use calculations. And so some people think, okay, here is this issue of tradition, that moon had to be seen by somebody. And others say, well, wait a minute, but it's a calendar. The point is to have the ease of calculations, that's important. And there are heated debates on that. And so I wrote an article about that actually for a Pakistani newspaper. We'll put a link to that
Sure.
article as well, in which, I find these, because this is close to my research as well, on how people take these issues of modern science and make it sort of like, how they make it practical. And we do find that most people are practical, but it could be an emotional issue depending upon how you are looking at it. So if you are looking at it, hey, I'm preserving a tradition, then that becomes a really important thing, and calculations can be offensive. And if you're using calculations, you go like, well, these people are backwards. Look, we have the science available, but these people are rejecting science and hence they are backwards.
So you could use it depending on which class you wanted to get out of in your undergraduate. You could just go with tradition or science depending on which day of classes you wanted to miss.
That's right. And so this is so in the US now, there is Islamic Society of North America that does use calculations, and that started using it a few years ago, and it got quite a bit of pushback, but they have persisted with that. There have been some interesting compromises in there. In Pakistan, there have been battles over there. There is a sort of like, I shouldn't say a corporation, but sort of like, a committee, which is called the Moon Sighting Committee. That's the job of the Moon Sighting Committee, to figure out when the new moon is going to be seen or not, right? And Turkey just uses calculations. So what I am interested in is that it's actually oftentimes not about religious ritual, but about authority. Because religious folks, for example, if there are imams, they say, wait a minute, we get to decide when a new moon or the new month, Islamic month, is going to start. In fact, the head of this moon sighting committee in Pakistan, I loved that interview. This was back in 2002, and I watched it on TV, and I still remembered it, and I actually took notes from it, because he was debating it with Meteorological Society in Pakistan, or association, and they used to give predictions. Now, the head of the moon sighting committee said, because they were having this debate, and the meteorological head person was saying, come on, we are in the 21st century, we should use calculations. And this guy said, he says, hold on, this new moon of Ramadan is an Islamic month. Meteorological Association has nothing. It doesn't have any jurisdiction on when the new Islamic month will start or not. And to me, that's a really interesting point, because what he is saying is that science or no science, that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is who gets to say when the new Islamic month is starting, and it's the moon sighting committee. And these kind of debates have happened in the past. Whenever new technology comes in, I know a lot of examples within Islam, but there are examples with Judaism, with Christianity, with every religion. I mean, the Sabbath issues, like so people go through, you cannot have automation and so on and so forth. And
the Pope let Boston Catholics have corned beef on St. Patrick's Day, but only like Boston Catholics. Weird stuff.
Special, right? But and then you have elevators on Sabbath, for example, sort of like that go by themselves. They stop at every floor and so on and so forth. In the same way, there have been debates about, for example, the use of printing press to print Quran. It's like, well, no, that won't be the right thing. But then, of course, then it gets over. You had this, for me, one of the fascinating ones was about loudspeaker, because the question was in prayers. The point was, okay, so is it the sound of the imam that is amplified, or is it a new sound that is coming in? So that's no longer the imam. So who are you following? So there are these interesting debates that happen, and more closely parallel to the moon sighting debate was that there was this issue of finding direction to Mecca. I mean, so as some people may know, Muslims pray towards Mecca wherever they are in the world. And earlier on, in the early days of Islam, Muhammad and the Prophet and his companions went to Medina, which is north of Mecca. So they prayed south. And then Islam spread pretty fast within the first 100 years. They were all the way up to North Africa and then towards Iran and other places. So there were these new mosques being built. And the question was, okay, so where are they pointing? And early mosques, this is a really interesting stuff. Some of these mosques are actually pointing south, even though they are, for example, in North Africa. And there is this question was, okay, should they follow tradition because that's where the mosques had pointed earlier on, or should they use mathematical astronomy to figure out exactly where Mecca is? And those debates actually continued for a few hundred years, because it was about following tradition versus using tools for calculations. And in fact, astrolabe was used. And to me, what's interesting about that is that I'm not putting a value on it, but it's two different systems of thinking, tradition versus using that. And a lot of people today talk about developments in mathematical astronomy that happened in order to solve the problem of finding direction to Kaaba or direction to Mecca. And so oftentimes people actually use this, oh look, a lot of mathematical astronomy was developed by Muslim astronomers because they had to find the direction to Mecca. So it's an interesting thing. And of course today you have these apps. You can have Qibla finders. Qibla is the same direction to Mecca. You can have these apps in there. Nobody's having that debate, right? So the way I look at these things as more about that we just happen to be living at a time today where this is a live debate about whether we should use calculations for the moon sighting or not. But soon, in the next few decades, next decade, people will be on the moon. There will be Muslims over there too. And so seeing the crescent will not really be possible because you will be on the moon. Not to mention that one day on the moon will be about 29 days. And so there are really fascinating problems or challenges, I should say, that will come up. In fact, that those kind of challenges, we've talked about it before, about the time on the moon, because different space agencies are trying to figure out how to standardize, how do we measure sort of like the same moon time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can imagine you bring in religious rituals in there, and you would really have to think in a different way. Not to mention that just purely from humans ourselves, we live in 24-hour circadian rhythms that because we have evolved here, we will have to figure out how we are going to do it because moon day or night is going to be very long. So this is an interesting example. If you just so to me, celebrating, thinking about Eid on the moon, in some ways, is a good exercise. That we are living in these sort of like live debates happening. People get very emotional one way or the other. But a few decades from now, just like the debates about finding Mecca or other things, this is not going to be an issue. I mean, people are going to be using calculations, and the reason is because religions are flexible and people are pragmatic. Mm-hmm. I think those are the two things. And again, if anybody has any doubt, if we can all religions can sort of like easily survive, sort of like the thing about Earth being at the center too, the universe, we just happen to be one of the planets around a star in a Milky Way galaxy, all the way from being at the center and everything revolving around us. I think religions have survived well. Religions have done well. So I don't think calculations is going to really be sort of like to detriment to any religion.
What was the best thing you ate on Eid?
Well, there is something called, and it's a weakness, I'm sorry to say, but it's called gulab jamun. This is a my mouth is watering right now, by the way. It's like this evolutionary response. No, gulab jamun, I don't even want to look at the recipe because it's just it's magical. These are honey balls. In some sense, they're very sweet. They belong to a category in Pakistan or South Asia called mithai, which just means sweets, and they are like very, very, very sweet. But we got them. Here is a local business plug from Bombay Royale.
Nice.
And they have these small little tiny gulab jamuns, and I can eat those like half a dozen. I shouldn't. I should say I shouldn't, but I can. And so does my son. I mean, he also loves it. Go okay. So that's we have to have that.